this is a little bit of a departure for us. I was telling Neylan before a little while ago that often we have authors who have done biographies or histories, and which is kind of our specialty here, but we're also very much in favor of the kind of book that has been published by Kofford Books, that Neylan is the author of Women at Church, which is kind of cutting edge material, and we like to think we're pretty progressive here. And I want to tell you that for the last several days I was really hoping to get through the whole book before we started tonight, and I haven't quite gotten there yet, but I'm very impressed with the quality of the writing, and she's got her finger on the pulse of women in the church today, and I don't think she really leaves anybody out, which we can't always say in our history, can we? So that's the book that is the main feature tonight. She has done other things. She has published in dialogue. We've just found out tonight that we have some of the issue of dialogue that was published in '07 about growing up Mormon in New York. Neylan has also published in Newsweek, Meridian Magazine, The Washington Post. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Mormon Women Project, which I've just, in the last couple of days, have spent some time on the website, and I'm very impressed with what I've seen. She has another book that was self-published back in '08, and which unfortunately we don't have. And I think we sold all the copies we were able to get in time of Sisters Abroad, interviews from the Mormon Women Project. So if you would like a copy of that book, please let us know, and we will be sure to order it in for you, and we apologize for running out, but I promise we have lots of copies of Women at Church. So I would now like to join with you in listening to our special guest speaker tonight, Neylan McBaine.
Does that work? Yes. I'm just gonna... Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's a real pleasure to be with you here, and I hope that our conversation is actually a conversation, and that you think of questions for me, and that we can really have a dialogue during this time, because, you know, I will spend a few minutes telling you sort of my own background and what prompted me to write this book and the process of writing the book, but I'd love to hear what your questions are. The first thing that I like to say about this book is that it is a conversation starter, and there are many things it is not, which I will talk about a little bit more later, but one thing that I really feel strongly that it is a conversation starter, and hopefully a bridge builder. And everybody is going to come to the book with their own experiences and their own perspective on women in the church, or women at church, and I'd love to hear those tonight, and I'd love to talk with you about how this book might play into and sort of fit into the experiences and perspectives that you have. So please do think of questions. I'll just spend a little bit of time giving you my background and an overview of the book and the process of writing the book. The book is a product of listening. 5 years ago in January, I launched the Mormon Women Project, and the process of launching that site really at the time felt like a culmination of a rather unique upbringing and unique experiences in the church. And at the time, I felt like, much of my life had led to launching that project, although I really had no idea what kind of response it was going to get. And the things that led up to the launch of the Mormon Women Project were the fact that I had a sort of unorthodox upbringing as the only child of a professional mother in Manhattan. And my father was baptized when my parents were married, but quickly went inactive. And so there was always a sort of balance in my home between my highly educated, very worldly father and my very devout mother, who was sitting here until just a minute ago, who at the same time had this international career. And so the perception that I had growing up as a girl, a Mormon girl in New York City, was that my mom, who was neither married in the temple nor had multiple children, nor stayed home with those children, was actually something of a hero. We love to say in the church that our football players and our singers are kind of our bridge to the outside world, and that was certainly the case with me. And so because of my mom's specific professional capacity as a singer, she was really heralded in the church, and I had the opportunity to perform a lot with her at various firesides and church gatherings. And so I look at that experience, and it kind of turns on its head the experiences that I've learned subsequently some other Mormon girls have had growing up. And it first dawned on me that not every Mormon girl sort of, was very comfortable with these non-stereotypical women in her life when I went to college. And I went to Yale, so it was a very small LDS population, but I had a fantastic Relief Society president who I served under there, and she really opened my mind to this idea that we needed, as a presidency, to really sort of nurture these girls that were coming thousands of miles away from home for the first time as 18-year-old college students, and many of whom were actually looking for opportunities to sort of distance themselves from the church for the first time. So that was the first time that I was really challenged with saying, okay, why are some of these girls not excited to come to church? For me, it was a lifeline and a haven in New Haven. But it wasn't for all the girls, and it really was the first time that I had to ask myself why. That experience at college was followed by 7 years in San Francisco, where I served under another remarkable Relief Society president. So these experiences helped both solidify my feeling that Mormonism produces remarkable women, but it also exposed me to some of the feelings that some women in these congregations were having, of just not knowing exactly how they were to bridge, their Yale education or their career aspirations with the seemingly limited job opportunities within church structure. And it was really the first time that I realized that maybe those two lived experiences were different from each other, and that one could affect the way we as young women could perceive the other. The San Francisco experience sort of came to a head when the Relief Society president and her family left the church after serving as our Relief Society president. And as my husband and I were very close to both the bishops she served with and with her and her family, we kind of saw these tensions unfolding during her time working with that bishop. And I handled the situation very poorly. I mean, I know looking back that it was pretty traumatic for me and our ward. And this was 10 years ago. So, there was conversation online about faith crisis, but it was certainly not it certainly wasn't given the sort of both emotional and academic attention that it is today. So I really didn't know where to turn, and a lot of what she was presenting to me was just quite foreign to my own experience, even though I could sort of see how the struggle she described had played out in our particular ward. And so I think, there was just a sort of period of confusion where I didn't really know what to do with this, and we just kind of went on, moved to Boston after San Francisco, had wonderful experiences there. And then in New York, when we went from Boston back to New York, I was home with children, really for the first time, and I think it was that time to sort of really think about how I wanted to spend my time, how I voluntarily wanted to spend my time. Is that combined with a desire to really get back into some early interests in writing, that really kind of opened up this idea for me of producing the Mormon Women Project. And it was really a light bulb moment. There have been a few light bulb moments in my life, and that was one of them when I knew, and I described this in the book, where I just knew that telling Mormon women's stories was my calling. I had told my story so many times growing up. You know, here's this kind of strange specimen of Mormonism, this like only child from New York City, you know. And I told people about that. I mean, I was featured, I remember, in the New Era, and you know, there was some faith-based teen show called like Faith Circle, and they came and they went to my school and they videotaped me, you know, at school, and I was always kind of this, you know, telling my story, and it just got tiring to hear my own story. And I thought, you know, there are so many wonderful people in the world who also have fantastic stories. It's interesting, at the time, you know, I told myself that. I'm not sure that I actually believed it, but one of the greatest blessings that's come to my life over the past 5 years is that I have gained a solid conviction that every single person has a story that has shaped them and created who they are, and is worth telling, and is their identity. And I've developed a real humility around that concept, and a real gratitude for the people, almost 300 people who have shared their stories with us at the Mormon Women Project over the past 5 years. And the response to sharing those stories has been tremendous. The purpose of the project was that I simply thought that by telling some of these women's stories, that we would be able to present models. A person who worked at the White House Project, which is sort of a gender basis think tank project, said a phrase that I believed before I even heard it, which is that we can't be what we can't see. And I think instinctually I responded to this idea at the time, even though I'm not sure I put it into words, that we as Mormon women are living in a culture where visible role models are particularly important now. It's a culture of social media. It's a culture of instant communication. It's a culture of popular role models, for better or for worse, who we can look to and sort of model our lives after in any number of minute ways. And traditionally, the story of the Mormon woman has not been told in as much detail as the story of the Mormon man, and I was instinctually responding to the need for sheer numbers of stories. The stories that we picked, however, really showed deliberate choice making with God's hand. The only criteria was that the woman had to define herself as active at the time of the interview, and so we've gotten a range of life situations, and a range of family situations, a range of career paths, a range of motherhood stories, of disability stories, challenges. Some are wonderfully philosophical. Others are very sort of chronological storytelling. We've had recovering heroin addicts. We've had, converts from Islam. We've had a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. We've had a survivor of the Khmer Rouge. We've had, just amazing stories. We've had Anne Romney. We've had Elizabeth Smart. We've had just what I hope is a real cross-section of what Mormon women are today. So I've been listening, and I've really tried to honor those stories by being a repository of so many of them, but also of being the repository of women's specific stories in their church experiences. And the way this came about was that in 2012, I was invited to give a talk at the Fair Mormon conference. Fair at that time stood for the Foundation for Apologetic Information and Research. So if you're familiar with the term apologetics, you probably are familiar with it, but it's a pretty conservative audience. And the Public Affairs Department of the church suggested me as a speaker. And at the time, I was almost unknown as a speaker. I had done a little bit of work with public affairs, but really had not done a lot of major public appearances. And I think that they assumed that I was just going to tell wonderful stories about all the women I had interviewed. But for some reason, I just felt like this was an opportunity that I couldn't let slip away, to share what I had been seeing going on in the conversation about women at church over the past year or so before that conference. And for some reason, I just had the courage, and I believe it was spiritually directed, that gave me the courage to say some hard things to an audience that I wasn't sure was going to be open to hearing those hard things in the spirit that they were intended. But I actually was extremely pleasantly surprised, and the talk has been read 50,000 times on the Fair website. So in the talk, one of the essential things I did was say, hey, we hear sometimes that women are not happy at their church experiences. And our gut reaction is to say, well, we're doing the best we can. We've got this wonderful doctrine about gender, and we have leaders who are trying their hardest, and they're doing such a great job with no job training and doing, professional jobs on top of it. And it's do-it-yourself church, and we're all here working our hardest. And if you're not happy about it, well, you need to work on your own perspective of why the church is the way it is. You need to work on your faith. And I saw time and time again this refrain that if you're unhappy at church, then you don't have enough faith. If a woman is unhappy at church, she doesn't have enough faith, because she is then unwilling to accept things the way that they are. And that is a direct affront to the divine leadership of the church. And if you contradict the divine leadership of the church, then you are not a true believer, a true follower. And I wanted to somehow deconstruct that and make it a little bit more of a more human, compassionate argument. And that's what I tried to do in the Fair Talk. And it was heralded at the time as sort of a middle ground, right? I wasn't saying either side was right. I wasn't saying that women at church are unhappy because the structure is wrong, but I wasn't saying women at church are unhappy because they're wrong. It was trying to find a common ground and say, you know what, we can do something about this, and shouldn't we do something about this, because these are our sisters, and because we are a do-it-yourself church, we have the power to make some of these changes that will at least ease some of their symptoms and make them more receptive to the embrace of the community. And I have to say, a number of those same themes are what prompted this book. Brad Kramer here of Kofford Books approached me last October about writing the book, and at the time it wasn't something that had even crossed my mind. I was doing a lot of speaking at conferences and continuing the Mormon Women Project. We published what I hope is just the first volume of a series of interviews from the project with introductions by key women, representatives of those particular subjects. In this case, Sisters Abroad was introduced by Sylvia Allred, the former counselor in the Relief Society presidency from El Salvador. So I was very busy with those projects, but when Brad mentioned it, I think I just kind of was like, I don't think I could write 200 pages. I don't know if I have that in me. But again, it was really a light bulb moment in December when I went to a conference in New York, actually for work. It was based on evangelical entrepreneurism, where a man named Dave Blanchard, who works for the Praxis Group, which is a VC, a venture capital firm for gospel-based companies and young startups, presented this framework, among many other things they talked about at the conference. But the framework that he presented for sort of starting your own gospel-based company was prayer, people, process, and perseverance. And he went through each one of those things, and they meant specific things in the sense of starting a company. But for me, I just thought, I can do that. I could do that, because that is a process that I would love to encourage each one of us as members to go through when we're asking ourselves the hard questions about women at church. When we ask ourselves, why are some women uncomfortable with their experiences at church, and what can we do about it? I felt like that actually provided the framework that I was looking for, and I wrote the whole outline for the book on the plane on the way home. To conclude the story, I just want to give credit to Brad and Lloyd Erickson of Kofford Books, and also to my husband, who took my kids for every Saturday from January to June, so that I could write this, and also in the evenings from about 9 to 11. That was my writing time. And it was a heroic effort on his part. And there are so many people who went into the writing of this book. For about the first 3 months, pretty much all I did was network and reach out to people and interview people. And several people were key in giving me access to voices, local leaders, male and female, just members around the country. And I tried to listen, and I heard their stories. I heard their stories of what's going really well, and I inevitably heard stories of what's not going so well either. And I tried to keep the book really positive while also, tactfully pointing out why some women are struggling with the contemporary church life as it contrasts to their lived experience outside of the church. And so I hope that what this book does, as I said in the beginning, is really be a conversation starter. It is a middle ground, which means that I will be failing if there aren't a lot of people upset with me. Because the people who feel passionately about this subject on one side or the other may not feel like this is speaking directly to them, and that's okay. This book is not an exploration of doctrine. It's not an exploration of gender doctrine. It's not an exploration of motherhood or the fall or mother in heaven. It's an exploration of our relational, the relationship we have with our faith as it plays out in our community. Because faith is relational. It's not transactional. We don't just get faith. We have to nurture it. We have to develop it. We talk through our whole lives about developing our testimonies and sort of the ebb and flow of our testimonies and continuing to grow them. And part of that growth and part of that nurturing is the way that the relationships we have with the people who we are on this spiritual journey with. And so what I hope the book does is help us come together as a family and as a community, and really understand that people are in different places in the way that they react to what happens at church, in that community. And that we have more tools that I think some of us are aware of to make those experiences positive, even for people who are different from us and might be perceiving things differently. So again, that's my journey. Thank you for coming. I'd love to answer some questions. Before I do, as you're thinking about your questions, let me ask you to do a couple of things. This book, again, because it's about a community, needs community input. So I've done my part in interviewing hundreds of members and leaders and asking them what's working in their church experiences today. We've built a website, womenatchurch.com, where we are inviting members and leaders to add their own stories of what's working in their wards and stakes and missions today. Is there something that's happening in your ward that you feel is actively actively allowing women to be seen, heard, and included in new and innovative ways? Are there things, pass this along to somebody who is in a ward where they've been telling you about this. This is a sort of crowdsourced effort to bring back together the best practices throughout the American church, at least. And if you read the book and enjoy it, please also consider going to Amazon and reviewing it. And I would be grateful if you do those two things. So I think that's it for me for the moment. Does anybody have any questions? Where are you all coming from in this conversation? Yes.
having not read the book yet, what things are not working for women? What were some of the experiences you've listened to that were not working for women?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll start by actually outlining the 6 sort of factors that I've identified as things that might be creating tensions for some of our women, and things that will increase for our daughters and our granddaughters. And these are things that sort of, when you line up the experience in the church with a woman's experience in the lived world, sometimes are becoming more and more divergent. Perhaps more so than at any time in history. The exception, of course, is polygamy, where Mormon women were living so far outside of their, American counterparts, of their sort of Gentile counterparts, right? But even in the time of polygamy, we were so geographically separated that there wasn't this sort of day-to-day interaction, this media barrage of messages that there is today about what a woman should be, what her opportunities should be, and what her life should look like. So
they're not just hearing it; they're experiencing it.
They're experiencing
Mormon
it.
women are in the world.
They are in the world.
And in church.
And this is something that I talk about a lot, because our leaders are not, well, let me get to that actually. I'll read the 6 things. So the disconnect between the lived experience and the church experience. So as Brad just said, our girls are out there. They're being told to get education. They're being told to be prepared to provide for families, not just in the case of a spouse's death anymore. It's really there's a lot of messaging about self-fulfillment and the ability to sort of do a number of things, and maybe in different eras of your life, but certainly even at the same time. And this contrasted with the church experience, where it may be the only place in their contemporary lived experience where they're being told something is off limits to them because of their gender. So we could explain why those things are off limits to them just fine, but objectively, some women look at that as simply a fact. Some things are off limits to me because of my gender. And some of us, myself included, are at peace about why that is the way it is. But for some women, because the lived experience in 21st century America is so gracious to women and so open in the opportunities, really nothing is off limits, that can be difficult. So that's number 1. The importance of diverse visual representation in modern culture. So in this point, I talk about how this idea of the instant communication and the ability to create a tribe around a mentor or a voice who you admire. So, a young girl can follow anybody from Beyonce to the Pope on Twitter and know instantly what those people are thinking. She can feel like she's part of their tribe. She can look to them as mentors. And we empirically do not have those same kinds of I won't say well, we don't have those same kinds of role models that are as visible and as prevalent as a young girl will find in her external life.
You mean female role models?
Female role models. Female role models, yeah. The misuse of councils and church structure. So, to your question, I try and stay away from the specific negative stories. There are a lot of them, and in fact, I know people are actively collecting these. But there are obviously experiences that women have that turn negative because of the lack of female representation in a disciplinary council or in any sort of ecclesiastical counseling situation. So I sort of just touch on that and say this happens. The rise of single sisters. The rise of single sisters, I think, it probably is pretty obvious to many of us that this idea of priesthood being the power by which we interdependently achieve exaltation as a man and a woman is something that, with the rise of single sisters, is difficult for them to really hold on to during this life. So, estimates, and the church doesn't put out official statistics, but estimates are that up to a third of women in the church are single. And I am not sure if that means like 12 to however, or if it means just marrying age. So that's got a big asterisk next to it. But then the point is that the number is large. And those single women are defined by what they are not, right? They are not wives, they are not mothers, they are not sexually active. And so they have trouble sort of saying, well, what am I, right? What is my identity as a Mormon woman? We don't necessarily give them a lot to grasp onto, especially since in past generations, at least, we've really not celebrated the Mormon woman's role as a community, as a worker, and as a professional, and as a community participant. Greater awareness of history. Some of you are, this group certainly is probably aware that for the first time several years ago, the minutes from the Relief Society meetings, the original Relief Society meetings, were made public, both through the Joseph Smith papers and through a Deseret book publication called In the Beginning of Better Days. And this meant that the membership is now privy to a comparison between what the Relief Society was originally constructed to be and what it is today. And that comparison shows a lot of things that are different. And that can be hard for some women who ask themselves why an organization that was set up by Joseph Smith in very specific ways in those meetings structurally is different from what it is today. And then the last one is the disconnect between the doctrine and practice of equality. In this section, I talk about the use of the word equal. It's a word that our leaders use a lot to describe men and women, but the point that I make is that that word is used very specifically to describe equal opportunities to return to live with Heavenly Father, equal opportunities to develop our potential. And when we say men and women are equal in the church, we rhetorically talk past the world in which equal means the same. It means the same access to opportunities, the same abilities, the same opportunity to, aspire to the same job, make the same amount of money, travel the same places, hold the same positions. All of that is what the world means when it says men and women are equal. And that's different than what we mean, and yet that rhetorically has not necessarily really been spelled out. And so we sometimes feel like, when we claim men and women are equal, there's an element of hypocrisy that we feel about it. We're like, well, I want to say men and women are equal, and I believe it, but I can't say it in the way that person in the world is saying it, right? And so we're just not sure how to reconcile those. And again, our leaders are not telling our women to back away from the world. On the contrary, our leaders are actually making steps themselves, or taking steps themselves to encourage women to be more visible in their communities, and they're making our women more visible in our communities. They're moving the female general officers to the middle of the conference stands. They're putting the apostles' wives up on the stands for general conference. They're adding pictures to the conference center. They added the pictures to the ensign. They're encouraging our general female leaders to be more public. In fact, the Mormon Women Project has received permission to interview all 9 of the new Young Women General Board members in an effort to look for channels for our official female general officers to have a voice that is not structurally built in. So, so not a lot of, to answer your question, not a lot of specifically negative stories. That's very deliberate, but I do outline where those tensions are. Yes?
We know that way back in Brigham Young's time, he encouraged women to get education, sent women to medical school, and so on. Mm-hmm. That is not a new thing, therefore, because Brigham Young has been dead quite a while.
Yes.
Okay. There's a Sunstone issue that has a cover title, A Gift Given, A Gift Taken. And it concerns females' blessing, giving blessing.
Yes.
Whatever the third thing was I was going to mention, I forgot.
Would you like me to respond to those points?
Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've mentioned is exactly when I say the tension of knowing history. Those are exactly the kinds of things that I'm speaking about, because when you can see the disconnect between the way that the Relief Society was set up in the minutes and the way it is today. But it's also a fascinating journey to actually follow some of those trends throughout the course of the 1842 to today. For instance, the idea of female blessings. One of the things I kind of chuckled at sometimes during the summer, during the Ordained Women conversations, was that there were a number of comments I'd see here and there that said, our women have always been happy. Do you think that our foremothers were doing this and complaining about things and agitating for things? And I just had to laugh because there was about 100-year period, literally 100 years, where our women and the male leaders were discussing the propriety of female blessings. And in the minutes, Joseph Smith says that female blessings are no sin. There's no evil in a woman laying on her hands using faith to heal. And yet you can, there are wonderful papers that have been written that actually sort of look at statements across the course of the next 100 years and to actually have the healing blessings phased out in about the 1930s, early 40s, officially. And I just look at that as an example of how this conversation really has been kind of going in waves for really the whole history of the church. I mean, gender discussions were in the soil we grew from with polygamy and, those early conversations about how are men and women going to work together in this organization really were at the foundation of the church. So, I don't know. Those are my thoughts on that. Yes.
I have a couple of questions about Relief Society. I'm not really sure how to say both of them, but is there any, let's try the positive one first. When the curriculum became the same for priesthood and Relief Society, what impact has that had? I mean, on the one side you could say this is what makes everyone the same because we're teaching adult members always the same. Mm-hmm. Has that been a positive, negative? What impact has that sameness of
let me answer that, and then I'll be sure to come back to you for another question. So I actually use this as an example in the book. Have you read the book yet?
I have not.
Okay, well, great. Well, you actually put your finger on a good example. So I use this as an example of the way we've become unaccustomed, or we just have never grown accustomed to citing women's voices and examples in our lessons and talks. So, and it's also a great example, and I'll explain that, but it's also a great example of how so many of these changes have not happened maliciously. They've just happened kind of as byproducts of other good things, right? So, in 1995, President Hinckley, we adore President Hinckley. He wanted a doctrinal book in every member's home. The church was growing, was becoming international. There were members who couldn't afford Deseret Book products, or they had maybe their quad, and he wanted a doctrinal book in every home. So the Teachings of the Prophets was introduced. So wonderful, right? I mean, he only had inspired good purposes in mind. The byproduct of that was that for 17 years we have had no female voices represented in Relief Society or priesthood. 0. And this is coming from decades where the Relief Society General Board wrote their own curriculum. So the Relief Society lessons were all about women and about women's needs. And some of you probably remember these lessons. There was the Relief Society magazine, there was the Eliza R. Snow poetry contest, and wonderful outlets and voices for women that were really nourished in a particular Relief Society environment. And then we went to this other model where that gets a doctrinal book in every member home. It also equalizes the emphasis that's put on men and women being doctrinal scholars, right? So there's no excuse for a woman now to say, I'm not a scriptorian, or I don't know what the prophets say, right? So all those good things, and then you have this this byproduct. And so it's about like, we kind of, my takeaway is, it's the member's responsibility. There are very few Relief Societies that actually stick to that book exactly in the Relief Society. So if we're already bringing in lots of conversation and other resources, let's bring in voices of women. We can still use teachings of the prophets, but use women's voices and women's leaders to comment on what's being taught in teachings of the prophets, and we can rectify some of that. So, what's your other question?
The other question, again, about Relief Society is, the common phrase is, we've got the largest women's organization in the world. But since 1995, it's not been about women at all. I mean, it's under the leadership of men. You learn about men. That's all that's talked about. It's not about women. So how is it a women's organization? It's only a segregated.
I will tell you that probably one of the greatest sadnesses women express to me when they talk about the women's experiences at church is that there seems to be a lack of real purpose to grasp onto as a member of the Relief Society today. So all I can do is validate what you're feeling, and that I think that I like to think that there's an awareness of that at the general level, and because I can see, and somebody said the other night, which something I didn't even intend to do, which was de-vilify Julie Beck, but I guess I de-vilified Julie Beck because what she did was try and give us something concrete to hold on to, which was our history. And it's something very academic. It's not starting a hospital, and it's not growing grain and all those wonderful things that they used to do. But she was trying to do something, right? She gave us a book. She gave us a rally cry around our sisters, our women, our foremothers. And I think that President Burton now is trying to do something similar with this idea of a covenant path, covenants. So I think that they're trying to grasp onto these concepts to act as the same sort of like unifiers that, relieving the poor and saving souls used to take a much more like service-oriented and tangible approach to doing. But you're not alone. Yeah.
So what are some, if we want to start using women's voices more, where are good places where we can find teachings of Eliza R.
So
Snow?
glad you asked.
Perfect.
Let's see. So this is really a very young field. I'll give you an anecdote. So, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but I'll make the point. So Brittany Chapman, who is at the Church History Library, was preparing a talk for a conference just a few weeks ago, and in preparation she did an informal poll of, I think, about 6 different Sunday school classes, just around the country through friends and stuff. So she ended up polling, I think, well over 100 people. And did you read the results of the survey? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think it was.
I can't remember the numbers, but she
it was
asked.
just 2 or 3 women. So she asked them if they recognized names.
So the challenge was list 5 names from male names from Mormon history and list 5 female names from Mormon history. And
besides Emma,
besides Emma, there was almost no one.
Marjorie Hinckley and Emma.
They invented some.
They described the lady who blessed her ox. Didn't know any names. But the number, it was like, I think 98% of men could list 5 men. 98% of people could list 5 men, and I think it was 12% could list 1 or more women. So, and Emma Smith, mostly because of Doctrine and Covenants 25, was one that most people got. But after that, it just dropped off precipitously. I think Eliza R. Snow and Lucy Mack Smith were the other. So it's a young field. That said, there's really exciting work happening. So part of the challenge, though, is that a lot of the work that's going into excavating women's voices and stories is being done in sort of an encyclopedic way. So for instance, the Women of Faith series that the Church History Library, Rick Turley and Brittany Chapman are putting together, that Deseret Book is publishing, is a 7-volume series, 1 volume covering every decade. Or maybe it's a little bit more than a decade. It must be a little more than a decade, because it's going up to contemporary times. So they have taken brief biographical sketches of women from that decade that independent scholars are submitting. And they're wonderful stories in those. They're fantastic. I use an example of one of them in the book where this woman who's living 10 miles outside of Kirtland in about, what would it be, about 1860, I think, something like that, is feeling really left out because she's not in Kirtland. She's in this other community. And so to be a good member missionary, she goes to the bar every night and she sets up the billiard balls and she hangs out with the people while they're drinking and playing pool. And she says in her story, you know, I feel like this is the way that I can be a missionary and help them know that the Mormons are not scary. And I just love that. And I say in the book, it's probably because, like, you know, how are you correcting my year? Probably. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. But I think, like, for me to read that, I mean, how many parties have I attended, you know, in high school and college where I was, like, the person setting up the billiard balls for the drunk people? Like, so many, and I just resonated with that so much. But the problem is, you have to slog through 300 pages of those brief biographical sketches to find jewels like that, right? And so there isn't a great sort of, like, very easily accessible quote book yet that we could go to. To underscore this even more, the talks of our General Relief Society presidents over our history have never been formally presented. They're not on LDS.org. If you search for Eliza Dargeneau on LDS.org, you get 0 results in most categories. That's Eliza, and so you have to really search yourself. So Deseret Books starting to put out some great things. What we need to move towards is, you know, for them to say, oh, we're already doing a book about women, we don't need another one, which is kind of where they are right now. What we need them to say is, we need lots of books about women in different formats. We need the biographical encyclopedia, but we also need, you know, commentary about women in the early church, or we need commentary about women in the church in the 1950s, or we need more people working on that area of excavating their voices and pulling out these great nuggets that we can use in our talks and lessons. The Church History Library just put out a new section of their site called Women of Conviction, which shares great stories of some of the first female missionaries. Did you know that there was a woman who was sent on a mission without her husband? So her husband stayed home and she was sent out on the mission. A great story of Lucy Mack Smith being the first official proselytizing missionary she went up to, I think, Canada with Hiram. I might be missing that, but anyway, great stories like that. So you have to look for them now, but it's definitely a growing area.
Can I comment that
Yeah.
a good quality bookstore will have such material, and this bookstore does. So
And are there any books that you could recommend?
Oh, yeah.
Anything particular?
Yeah, in fact, some of the ones that you mentioned, Women of Faith, and I mean, there's a whole lot. There's women's voices. I mean, we could stack up a whole bunch that have been done in the last 20 years, particularly. The Daughters of the Utah Pioneers has compiled a big 4-volume biographical set. There's a lot of things that have been done, but not nearly enough, and that's the point you're making, that
And
this
again,
is
the
just the
format is
beginning.
very
But if
heavy
honestly, if
often.
anybody wants some suggestions on some books that do have the women's voices in them, we can make some recommendations, show you some of the things that we have that have been published, or find them if we don't have them currently.
And then that's a great opportunity to plug the Mormon Women Project too, because, you know, the Mormon Women Project is not an academic project. So I grew up with Claudia Bushman, told her I was doing this. I think she looked at me like I was crazy because she's a pure academic. She's like, why would you want to put something out there on the web that's a commercial and just, you know, kind of, you know, doesn't adhere to academic standards? And I said, Claudia, I'm a marketer. I want it to be easily accessible. And so that means that our stories kind of are a little bit rough sometimes, but there's great stuff in those interviews that just really soulful contemporary stories that are great. Yes?
You mentioned Claudia Bushman. When her husband was down at Claremont College, she taught a class at Claremont, and it was regarding the women in the class were to go out and interview people, and it's my wife was one in the class. It's
Great.
remarkable that the journals that have come out of
Yes, absolutely. Her oral history project at Claremont is really groundbreaking. There it is. This is so
Also from Kofford Books.
Yes, also from Kofford. So this is a great example of what I'm talking about, of like a different format of highlighting women's stories, of women's voices. So what they do is those are essays that like are commentary about the interviews, and there's a really important place for that. The difference between my project and Claudia's project is, of course, that that's an academic resource, and you have to go to Claremont and make a reservation at the library to access them. And they're working on that, actually, making them more accessible. But again, that's kind of why she was like, you know, thinking I was lowbrow, just publishing them on the web. Yes.
In a recent church news last week before, is a story about a sister way back who with her husband was traveling, but she became kind of a missionary because being female, she was more welcome in the situation. And someone else will have to dig that up for me because I cannot remember. But it made me think that now, with so many more female sister missionaries being called, there's got to be many more reports of incidents. I mean, Temple Square, all the sisters that work on Temple Square, few brethren.
Right.
You know, so.
Yeah. One of the points I make in the book is that, you know, this conversation has to continue because of all of these sister missionaries. I mean, they're going to come back to a structure that's different from what they're experiencing on their mission. In fact, on their missions right now, the structure is actually more egalitarian than it is in the local churches, because they are giving these sisters some of these leadership opportunities.
Sister training leaders.
Yeah. So there's a necessity, absolutely, to answer that. Yes.
Are you aware of the fact that in many areas, bringing in material that is not in the lesson is frowned upon?
I am aware of that.
Hardly a week goes by that in one of my Facebook groups, somebody doesn't say, I have just been asked to teach Relief Society or to sub in Relief Society, and the email says, please stick to the manual.
You know, all I can say about that is I think it's unfortunate, and I've taught gospel doctrine at every ward I've ever lived in, and nobody's ever said anything to me. So either the resources I'm bringing in are superior, and they don't dare say anything to me, or else I've just lived in good. You know, intellectually I understand why that is, but I think what's happening is, well, I'll give you an example. In sacrament meeting in my ward 2 weeks ago, a woman got up, introduced herself as a USC law grad, practicing lawyer, and said, I've been asked to speak on this conference talk. And I don't really know what to say about it, so I'm going to read the talk. And that was her talk. So she read the whole conference talk and sat down. And I think, you know, I know I'm being recorded, but don't quote me on this. I think there's a sort of theological laziness that comes, and I think what we do is we compensate for it anyway, especially in Relief Society. I know in my experience, we compensate for it by taking a couple paragraphs out of the manual and then just talking about it a lot, right? And so what we have is people's experiences and their own philosophies about what, you know, those few paragraphs, rather than, so I don't think I would mind if people really delved into the manual, but I'm not sure we're really delving into the manual. I think we're reading the talk and we're skimming the surface. And so I think that, you know, we're not taking advantage of that sort of the good that could come out of really just focusing on the materials. Yes.
There's so much cultural on that, though. There's 4 to 5 Sundays in a month. 2 are out of the teachings of the presidents. But a Relief Society presidency can teach the first Sunday. You can choose a conference talk from Sister Burton. You can have a combined thing. But culturally, we're just not used to doing that.
No.
You got 3 out of the 5 that you could use to exploit that.
Absolutely. And I talk a lot about that, about, like, you know, how men and women can express discomfort when a woman is talking about a woman as a leader. You know, I talk about women a lot in the book as their own agents of change. You know, I've sat in a Relief Society. I mean, I sat in a sacrament meeting in my own ward in the middle of San Francisco, where it was an all-female program. And this was before I had gotten my hands on the bishop, but he himself had come up with an all-female program, and systematically every woman who talked on that all-female program apologized. One even quoted Paul and said, well, you know, I guess we can all go home now because I'm just supposed to be silent as I talk to you here. Like, what? Let's own it. Let's claim it, you know? So, yeah, I think, you know, it's a lot of it is a cultural adaptation for women to feel comfortable saying, these are my leaders. These women have ecclesiastical insights for me that are worth sharing and learning from. Yes?
Where do you anticipate discussion realistically?
Realistically,
Would you mind
I'm only
repeating
trying to change culture, so I don't know if that's realistic or not.
that? Just repeat it.
She said, where do you think this will lead? As I said, this is a discussion starter. So one of the things that I found is a challenge right now is that some of these things are happening in some places. So some women are experiencing innovative leadership. You know, some I have stories in the book of some women being given responsibility for planning the entire sacrament meeting program. I have examples of some young women being invited to be visiting teachers with their mothers, and some women being invited to be included in Relief Society opening exercises so that there's a similar assimilation to Relief Society as the boys have to priesthood. And it's been interesting because in a lot of the comments about the book over the past few weeks, people have said, oh, well, that's happening in my ward, or that's not happening in my ward, but it happened in a previous ward. And so I think one of the things that I really hope from this book is that maybe some of these practices become more consistent, and it won't be quite so much like, you know, well, I live in X place, and so we're just like, you know, not doing any of this, but I live in New York, and so we're doing all of it, you know, where people can, there's you know, even if it's just slight, but just a new expectation of what the standard is. And I think that can happen if there really is a broad, widespread conversation about, you know, the way we're presenting women publicly, the way we're visibly celebrating them in our communities, and the way, and an increased awareness of what the optics look like to the outside world, and really working all together to improve that. So, you know, I'm not trying to solve anything overnight, but I do think some conversation could happen.
Let's take two more, okay?
Yes.
Have you
Or
had
three.
any conversations with the general women leaders, other than doing interviews, possibly?
No, but I know they're aware of me. So that's what I can say. Yes.
Have you, in your research, done much with the woman's exponent or exponent two?
I'm very familiar with both of them. I'm familiar with the historical place of the women's exponent and how important it was, and you know, wonderful. It just served an invaluable place in the early church. You know, its role in the suffrage movement was fascinating. And Exponent 2, I've been to their retreats and, you know, am a regular subscriber. So, I am aware of them, and I think that, you know, back to Claudia Bushman, she had her 40th, she had a conference where we celebrated 40 years of her work about, 3 weeks or a month ago. And she told in her keynote speech about the founding of the Exponent 2. And how meaningful that was to her. And it was also a painful experience for her because it wasn't universally well received. But, you know, I think that Exponent 2 has been under fantastic leadership for the past few years. They're going to get new editors this spring. And I think these two current editors have just really made it a very strong voice, and I enjoy it very much. So are you looking for something more specific about its impact, or?
No, I just think it's had a tremendous impact.
It has.
Both the first one and the second one. We've had 40 years of Exponent 2
Yeah.
with many, many women all over the world
Yeah.
expressing their viewpoints and their problems.
Yeah. One of the clever things that this current editor team has done is outsource the fourth quarter issue, which allows them to focus on other things during Q4 of each year. But 2 years ago, I got to edit the fourth quarter issue of Exponent 2, and we made it all about the importance of telling women's stories. So it was the Mormon Women Project issue of Exponent 2, and that was really fun because I hadn't dealt in a print medium at all up until that point, and there's a lot of art involved in the whole process of layout and getting letters to the editor and really making it an interesting, complete issue was kind of a new challenge for me. So I appreciated the opportunity to do that.
Okay, you had one. Let's make this the last one.
Okay, one comment, I heard an interview that you gave on the radio a few months ago, and something that really impressed me was, and I may have gotten this wrong, correct me if I did, that you said something about reading the handbook in a way, the official handbook in a way that was more permissive than restrictive, not looking for what women are not allowed to do, but if it doesn't say anything, go ahead and do it. That kind of attitude, which I thought was a fabulous way to look at this. And I'm thinking that a lot of this change is going to be taken care of generationally, because as you said, the young women of today don't have limits on them in the world, and they're going to bring that spirit in. I think as a church we need to, so much of it is involved with language. If there were just some prepositional changes in temple covenants, there'd be a lot of us that were a lot more happy with that. If there were, I served with my husband on 2 missions where he was a mission president and an MTC president, and the best I ever got was sister or mom.
Yep.
Even though I taught as much doctrinally as he did, and I saw that as my function. I was busier than I had been since I had 2 children under the age of 2.
Yep.
But I was mom, and I was constantly reminded, you are not the president, don't overstep your bounds.
Excellent points all, and I think there are a number of people, including an important section of my book that talks in our lived experience, we're used to having some sort of gradation of our public involvement, right? We have titles in our jobs, we have different levels at school of experience and expertise, and so to have, Sister Burton be called Sister Burton as well as me to be Sister McBaine, I want to honor her in some way, right? And one of the things I note in the book is that actually the importance of titles for men has increased, because we compare Brother Brigham, Brother Joseph, right? It was fine to call them brother, but now, heaven forbid, you call anybody but president, right? Whereas the importance of titles for women has decreased, because we had official documents calling Presidentess Snow and Prophetess Snow and Presidentess Smith. And so why has that happened? Names are important. We know that from the temple. We know that from the scriptures, that the significance of names. And so, but we don't have names for women such as yourself. I mean, do you want to be a matron? You could be matron, right? I don't think anybody under the age of 85 wants to be a matron, right? You can be matron, right? So I am not alone in drawing attention to that. Sharon Eubank at her Fair Talk just a few weeks ago really beautifully talked about the need for a new language, and Valerie Hudson Kassler talks a lot about the need for a language around motherhood and what that means outside of a biological function. Yeah.
Thank you very much.